at what this week's reading has been for you, any initial impressions, experiences, etc., etc. But let's start with Dai, if you don't mind, Dai. Just letting us know how the read is going for you.
Oh, no.
Oh, did we lose Dai?
You know, we heard her before.
We did.
I've got her listed as being muted right now.
Hey, Dai. I guess just
Okay.
oh, there you are.
Yeah, I
We hear
read music, architecture, and painting. I didn't get to literature.
That's fine. That's all good. I think we're all kind of moving along in this chapter at our own pace. So how about Ed? How's it been going? How's the read been for you?
This week, I haven't been able to do much reading, unfortunately. But I did read parts of this chapter a couple of weeks ago when I was engaged in another little side project. I find that since I come from more of a literature background anyhow, I found this section on literature much more comprehensible for me. I still have trouble with I really like visual arts. I'm having trouble with my ears and the tonal or the atonalities that come in. So I certainly do appreciate Marco's little introduction here. It reminds me of things that I need to deal with more. But that's where I am right now.
Awesome. I'd be interested in hearing later what your experience with the literature section was, and why it came more. Now, I know your background is more with literature, but I'd be curious about the connections you drew. John, I don't see your video anymore, but if you're there, maybe try to unmute yourself. Testing, testing. Okay, well, we'll come back to John. Hopefully he'll be back. Marco.
Hi.
How was the read for you?
Well, I just read it this morning, and I didn't get all the way through the chapter that we're scheduled to discuss, but I think I got enough into it to appreciate a few things and to enjoy a few things, particularly in the music section, where just before we went live, I was playing an excerpt from a piano piece by Schoenberg, who Gebser references in the chapter, early on in the chapter, as an example of this atonal music, and the atonal paralleling the sort of the infusion of a temporal, or the infusion of the temporal dimension, the eruption of time, and the breaking of 3D space, because we'll come to it, but he associates tonal, like the octave, the seven notes of the octave, with like a three-dimensional space, and atonal is like a four-dimensional type of music. So it just kind of set me to listening to some Schoenberg, which I'm not like a huge music buff, but I've come across the music before, and Stravinsky for sure. And so I enjoyed reading about it and some of the reflections on aesthetics that he starts getting into here.
Yeah, that's interesting, Marco. Would you say that this chapter is more like the part 1 area, where he's kind of going into more detail and giving you more vivid examples in art? Do you think the arts are helping here a little bit more than the previous chapters? Because we've all sort of felt sort of a little bit of a lag in, literally, what did we call it? Anachronistic examples. And now we're going into the arts, and maybe the arts have a little bit more, I don't know, pull or vitality.
Well, I'm biased, so I don't know if I can answer that really honestly, but I think that one thing that distinguishes the arts perhaps from other knowledge disciplines particularly, is that knowledge disciplines progress. Like, you know something and it's more true than what you knew previously. Whereas with art, I think that there's transformation in art, but at the same time, you could go back and listen to Schoenberg, or go back and listen to Bach for that matter, or I have a CD of ancient Greek music, which is apparently authentic in some way, and listen to that, and there's there's a presence or a force of presence that comes through, which transcends time. So I think that may be part of the quality that we could feel in this chapter as he kind of goes into the realm of the arts, and music, architecture, painting, literature, and begins looking at the manifestations of aperspectality in the arts. So yeah, I mean, I think but I'm biased because I happen to like art.
Well, I'm biased too, so I would agree with you in your your assessment. Cool. So I guess let's hop to the next person, Nicholas. If you want to unmute yourself and just let us know how the read's been going for you.
Hey, everyone. Well, as usual, I haven't been following along with the group exactly. I just had a very busy time, but I read this whole book not that long ago, so I did go back and skim the arts chapters. And I thought we were actually going to discuss the music one last week. I had some strong reactions to this music chapter. As I might have mentioned to the group last time, I'm one of these people who have a lot of issues with 20th century atonal music and so on. I think I don't want to sort of hijack my introduction. I'll just say I had some reactions. I can dilate on them as time allows. And the other chapters, I'm more agnostic about, and I'm curious about the dual sciences and the literature stuff. Curious more about.
Great, excellent. Well, looking forward to hearing more about your reactions. But okay, great. So for next person is Oliver. I see, Oliver, you have video today. So how has the read been for you? And any initial impressions?
Yeah, well, I'm way behind on the read because I'm, like I talked about last time I was on. It's like a cheesecake, something you kind of want to absorb slowly and really savor. And as you know, I'm on the reviewing Google Hangouts here. I'm kind of transcribing all of them. So I'm taking in this kind of perspective of just really focusing on the group and seeing what the group experience is and how we're kind of processing the material as we're going through it. So I can't really say anything specific about the chapters we're doing right now or anything specific recent. All my readings have been kind of, for the first, 200 or 300 pages, limited to that. So I'm pretty much just going to be observing you guys and like absorbing what you're offering, because that's what I'm here for.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you feel ready to comment on it, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on your observations of the group. And I think that would be interesting. I don't know if you want to comment on that now or not, but that would be cool.
Yeah, no, definitely. It'll be the salient thing that I'll be bringing up. I want to interject at times when I feel like the salient things that have been coming up so far come up again. So yeah, so I'll be jumping in as we go.
Excellent. Okay, so next we have Wendy. Hi, Wendy. Just let us know how the read's been for you and your initial impressions of the chapter that you're up to.
I have to apologize as well. I'm a little bit behind on the reading, so I haven't done the arts chapters yet. I did spend quite a bit of time, though, in the sciences section. It's funny, Marco, you said you're a little bit biased. I do have a very high affinity for art, but I read a lot about physics. So the physics chapter made a lot of sense to me, because especially quantum theory always made sense to me. And the idea of things spontaneously happening and that you can't ever pinpoint the locality of an electron because it's moving constantly, even if you know its speed and its direction, blah, blah, blah. That made perfect sense. So I kind of really enjoyed that chapter. I enjoyed the biology chapter. Psychology, I struggled with a little bit. It seemed obviously very Freud and Jung specific. I'm not an expert in either one of those. So it took me some time to get through it, and I just started the philosophy section last night. So I'm a little bit more well-versed in philosophy, but I'm taking my time, you know, kind of like Oliver said, and savoring it, because I really want to, kind of like I did the physics chapter, I really want to make sure I understand it and it works well. So again, I'm going to probably listen more today than anything else and just get everybody else's reactions to the music and literature sections.
Cool, wonderful. All right, so we've gone around. So I guess we can turn back and try to do some resemblance of a structure here. But we started, Gebser started with music, and I figure we can start with music. And sort of our initial impressions of his description for the aperspectival. You know, Marco, you were mentioning the sort of the three-dimensional tonal octave, which is interesting, and I know earlier in the book, Gebser talks a lot about the oct and the eight and the oct being about the daylight and sort of daylight consciousness, so I made that connection there too. But the atonal as sort of this four-dimensional sounds really intriguing. Does anyone have any impressions specifically about the music section or interesting highlights from here that maybe you would want to bring up? I don't know if I do or not, because music is not... I love music, but I don't really... This is all kind of new to me. I was sort of learning the language for it and go, oh yeah, octaves and tonal, okay. I had to kind of refamiliarize myself with all this terminology to sort of get where he was going with it. So if anyone wants to chime in here, that would be good.
Yeah, I'll chime in for that. I'm trying to just go right into my reactive mode, because I would say I know a fair bit about music history. You know, just to start with sort of the banal, the obvious, Gebser is writing here in the mid-century. I don't know exactly when this stuff got written down. It got published in the 49 and 53, I guess, part 2 and 53. But he's writing about early 20th century music and the you know, in the history of concert music, classical music, sit-down music, if you like, as opposed to popular dance music, whatever. You know, in those decades, there was a pretty dramatic transformation. You went from Brahms to Schoenberg being the most famous exponent of these various other systems that had a certain academic preeminence for quite a while, probably the big bulk of the 20th century. I would say they're fading now in some ways, though. It's certainly historically significant, the break from tonality to atonal music, and he spends a while on Debussy. I would classify Debussy and some other French figures around that time, Eric Satie and others, as kind of transitional composers, almost on the cusp of a more traditional organic structure, which is sort of represented most obviously by the late Romantics like Brahms. And then these other guys are fully atonal. This Czech composer Krženík. Schoenberg, again, a famous person mainly because he almost came to symbolize the whole movement. And I think this now gets a little closer to my personal reactions to this. There's always been a lot of hair tearing about this, even among musicians themselves. I mean, Schoenberg, I think, famously told other musicians, you know, sort of, look, I'm sorry, I hated to do this, but someone had to do it. There were other people who said that, you know, the collapse of tonal music was something that everybody regretted, but was somehow felt to be inevitable. You know, in some ways, it's a parallel development to things like modern art and painting, but in other ways, it's different in music. I think in painting there was more explosive excitement about the new. I think music by its nature is somehow more of a conservative art form. I mean, we all maybe collectively feel the need for something like tradition to make sense of music, just because maybe the human equipment, how we make sense of these aural experiences is just fundamentally different from our visual system. And so there's always been a lot of hair tearing about 20th century music. I mean, again, not just to delve onto my personal stuff, but for the last 40, 50 years, people who program these contemporary atonal compositions in classical music concerts routinely program this music right before intermission so that people don't leave. Because there's a large part of the musical going public that just hates this stuff. In fact, most of the musical going public hates this stuff, such as there is a public anymore at all, which is kind of another tearing subject. But so there's always been a vexed relationship, between people who are more closer to the inner circles, who are actually musicians themselves, kind of go crazy playing the war horses all the time and hate the fact that classical music has largely become a little bit of a museum. So there's strenuous feelings on both sides that you have to keep this stuff alive. But I mean, now getting lastly to my personal reactions, I always felt that something about early 20th century break from tonality was exaggerated and too far. And this is again just my personal view. I do think, as far as I understand what's going on today in contemporary classical or sit-down music circles, there is a kind of sort of a return to tonality, I think. I don't think that's provable. I think there are probably people who would dispute that, especially in academic circles and so on. But I always thought it was a kind of a travesty, a disaster. Maybe an inevitable one. I don't quite understand why or how. I have other personal theories I could go deeper into, but
Nicholas, for context, what kind of music would you like better? What kind of music do you feel most attracted to?
Well, I love music greatly, and I'm a sort of an amateur musician, fairly serious one, in a couple of different realms. I love the classical tradition, like a lot of people do. I love, I grew up like most Americans. I sort of grew up on rock and roll and various substrands of that, so I love that stuff too. In terms of the music I love best, I guess the classical tradition is something that's this thing of inestimable value that I feel has been partially lost or watered down. I don't want to go into I could spend a long time discussing specific strands of music that I love, but there was something that happened. Actually, some of these transitional composers, Eric Satie is a personal favorite of mine, kind of underrated composer. He wrote a lot of strange stuff, and he fell into strange circles with a lot of other postmodern artists as well. Again, his later stuff I have some questions about, but there's still diamonds in the rough there. So I love Eric Satie's music, and he's right on the cusp. He had problematic kind of successors. The Schoenberg and Krzyzewski and those other guys, I just didn't really hear nothing in, although I haven't made a thorough study.
I don't have so much experience of atonal music, but certainly in terms of the temporics, I'm putting on chat the music that I was introduced to 15 years ago, I suppose, by Bornstadt, a Norwegian pianist, and David Darling, American cellist. And it flows like the river and like the sea. I also heard David Darling play the cello while Coleman Barks recited Rumi poetry. And it's quite a different experience of music. It's not atonal, but you can't pick any time out of it. It's more a felt sense. So I think this section of the chapter rang true for me because of that experience.
I think it's important to note that the musicians that Gebser is looking at in this chapter come from a relatively narrow slice of the musical universe. And in this day and age, when not only do we have radio, but we have internet radio, and we have iTunes, and we have Spotify, and we could listen to basically anything at the click of a button. It's a relatively narrow, I think, analysis. And as an example, there is atonal music in jazz too, right? And the whole history of jazz, has these non-linear expressions, right? If Greg Thomas was here, I think he could help illuminate this for us pretty well. But that would be a whole, a whole universe unto itself of music that's not really based on the mental rational framework, right? And then if we go, global and look at other traditions, we see, various different kinds of manifestations: Indian music, Chinese music, the kind of resurgence of tribal musics, the drumming, and all of that have come with the cultural transformations of the 60s and beyond. So I think that, what the points that, let me just put it this way, the direction that Gebser goes in with looking at these manifestations of aperspectivity in atonal music, well, there may be other directions, many other directions that we can go in to find expressions or examples of aperspectival music, or of aspects of it. Like there's, Zach posted something in the forum. It's an artist named FKA Twig, and she's really young. But the way that she puts together all these different aspects and dimensions of herself as a woman, and as just kind of like a fierce feminine voice, but then also as a victim in the sort of power dynamics. But then there's a whole, I'm mangling it, but there's so many ways that we could look at music and find these emergent structures, like these ways of putting different aspects of the human experience and different relationships to time together. He gives a couple of lines to electronic music, right? And we could find so much to explore in electronic music or pop music. And what came to mind for me in that section was the Beatles, right? This is published before the Beatles came out, and the Beatles did something incredibly novel, not just novel, but it was a phenomenal new emergent in what art can be in the kind of synthesis of pop and these esoteric qualities and these mystical qualities, and the sexual aspect of it. I guess I used to like to listen to experimental modern classical music, like Schoenberg or Stravinsky or John Cage. Philip Glass also comes to mind, who's an interesting example because his name suggests transparency, right? And later in the chapter, the theme of glass comes up in the section on architecture as one of the elements that reduces the duality, or kind of attempts to bridge the duality between interior and exterior of a building. We can come to that, but yeah, I think it might be useful just to go to the text, because there's a section here which maybe speaks to more universal aesthetic questions, not specifically music. It's on page 461, and it's kind of biting in a certain way, but it's fun for that reason. It's at the very bottom. Krishenik, I think is how it's pronounced. His suggestion, I'm reading at the bottom, also describes the effect of the new music on us. Music based on the new kind of structure. And he goes on, its instability and impalpability are manifest in the lack of melody, of major-minor systemization, and a fixed point of reference in a basic tonality that make this music unendurable to all who still view the rational as the non plus ultra of all modes of realization. So he's kind of speaking to what Nicholas, your point about people not wanting to sit through this, sit through modern music, and why.
Well, if I can respond to that just before you even finish reading the quote, those are sort of potentially kind of fighting word. That's almost like saying, we're the unevolved. That's why we can't handle this stuff. That gets to the heart of really my questions about whether the whole Western musical tradition may have taken a wrong turn, or at least gone a little too far, or something. Yes. Anyway, let me just. That's enough.
Well, those are just the beginning of the fighting words, because in the next line he goes on to say, "This is understandable. Whoever lacks the assurance of his life and thought within himself, and must project it into a rationally conceived representation with which he constructs a system of security, must necessarily despair when faced with this music. For nothing in it affords him support, and consequently he falls into the error of labeling it as unstable." I'll just read 2 more lines. "Like the other arts, music is today nothing else than the attempt of mankind, awakening to a perspectivity, to find an expressive form that allows its spiritual security to manifest freely, knowing or feeling secure in its own itself." So he's basically, I think, he's saying, people who don't like modern, who can't, appreciate modern music are wimps or something like that.
Or worse.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind just reading one more line here, because it's in the middle of the next paragraph, and he's talking about beauty, and he's talking about how this atonal music kind of transcends the dichotomy of beauty and ugliness. And he says the criterion of beauty, which dualistically includes the quote ugly, is to a great extent irrelevant for the valuation of aperspectival manifestations, as indicated above. And then he kind of ascribes this, fetishism of beauty or something, as that those are strong words, but as a striving for mental neatness. And it's kind of like he's saying that these new forms they break with the harmonious wholes, they break with the octaves, they break with the sort of orderliness of mentally ordered, mentally constructed music, and thus they feel like a threat to the sense of security that we get, like that sort of cave-like magic sense of security. It's sort of like breaking out of that enclosure that mental rational space represents. I'm not saying I totally agree with him, because I hear your point of your side of the argument, which has to do with, well, we lose something when we go into these abstract expressionist kind of dimensions, right?
Yeah, I mean, should art be beautiful in general? That's a vexed question in the postmodern age. I think most people, and certainly the people on the street and the Philistines who do the funding and so forth, it's always going to be a rancorous one. Most people think that art should be beautiful. There's a confusing sentence right where you stop reading. And when I was skimming this over, I stopped here myself a few weeks ago. This assessment is not a rejection of the beautiful as such, as long as the, quote, beautiful, unquote, is not a temporal convention or an escape to an emotionally charged interpretation of elements which can be described only inadequately by such terms as harmonious or natural. That's a sentence with so many qualifications. I'm not sure if Gebser maybe lost track of what he was trying to say there. This assessment is not a rejection of the beautiful as such. So he's sort of taking a balanced stance. We want to. Beauty is still an important concept to Gebser, presumably, provided that the term is not being used as an escape or an interpretation of something else, but then there's something else he's vague about. This is a very confusing sentence if you try to parse it out. It's literally what it means, especially the last clause.
Mm-hmm. Inadequately by terms such as the harmonious or natural.
Can I jump in there for a second?
Sure.
And the reason is I finally found the sentence in German. You guys are always quoting the English version, and I'm in here leafing around trying to figure out where you are. But that's fine. And the sentence is actually clearer in German. But it's one of those typical Gebserian sentences that it's really difficult to simply translate into another language because of the way it's put together. German allows to make clear what the referents are within the sentence because of the cases that they use. So we end up with this, for example, an emotional interpretation of what that is that he was just talking about. That is very specific in German. So it has a concretion that English really doesn't allow us to give. But I think what he's trying to say here is, in one sense, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It can't be defined or set by simply what is in mode at the time, what we think might be beautiful, which is why ugly things can be beautiful in the proper context, because they allow us to see things and feel things that we otherwise would not see or feel. And I think that's part of it. And music for me, at any rate, and I think for a lot of people, is a very emotional medium. It's not, I mean, we all hear it and then it comes in, but it's something that we actually do feel, because most of what we hear is part of that vibrational surrounding that we don't have, for example, when we just look at something, when it's just visual. And a lot of the criticism and a lot of the comments that have just been made would apply almost word for word to visual arts. When people first encounter a lot of Picasso's work, they just go, well, what kind of shit is that? You know, a 3-year-old could do it. No, a 3-year-old can't. But there are other works of art that 3-year-olds could do, and sometimes it looks like they are. And it's very, very difficult, at least for me, to always, or to, at any time, really determine what was the good one and which one is crap. And we used to have very set criteria for that. We knew what we were talking about. And so it was easy to decide, well, that's good art, that's bad art, that's good music, that's bad music. And we don't have that so much anymore, because we have to react to it in other ways. And we're being forced to react to it in other ways. And I think the real advantage, especially in this part of Gebser, is he doesn't know what comes after. We do. And so I'm hearing a lot of things from Nicholas and Marco, especially in your interchange, that's helping me get a better understanding of what it was he was talking to, because I know nothing about people at the beginning of the 20th century if they weren't in physics or philosophy, for example, or literature. And so that's very helpful in trying to work some of these issues up. That's just my interjection there.
Dave, can you help us with that sentence still?
The very last sentence is, I'm going to give you a pretty chopped up literal translation of what I'm reading in German. So you're going to have to come along with this. Okay. This determination is not a rejection of beauty in and of itself, insofar as so-called beauty is not just a timely or a present time determined convention or an aesthetic flight reaction, or merely an emotional interpretation of that which is what is immeasurably or inappropriately described with the words harmonic or natural. And that can't possibly help with your English. But that's what
these translators actually didn't do such a bad job. I mean,
no, they didn't. I have the greatest admiration for these two guys. But they were able to pull out of this in English. I find absolutely phenomenal. A lot of effort went into this. So
I stand by my complaint that the sentence is tortured, because he says, I'm not rejecting beauty as such, so long as it's not this or this other thing or this third very complicated thing, but he doesn't say what he thinks beauty actually is. Now, that's a tall...
There I would agree with you 100%. Yes, he doesn't say what it is. He's only saying what it is. He gets very Zen-like here. Well, I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you what it isn't. And so I do agree with your critique there, Nicholas. Very much so.
I'm seeing a parallel here to the philosophical idea of the myth of the given, or the idea of nature as being just kind of given to us in its constitution, rather than being partially a construction of the mind. And with respect to music, I think what he's referring to by beauty, in the sense of a given sort of harmoniousness or naturalness, is that it's just the taking for granted of the the tonal structure, the octave, the sense of like what makes a piece, right? Like in certain conventions have arose in classical music about what constitutes the beginning, middle, and end of a piece, how how the different elements or the different instruments should be balanced to each other, what the tempo should be, whether or not there should, and a lot of experimentation form happened there. Like you go to Bach and you get the fugues, and he refers to this sort of circular structure, and you get these really interesting musical structures, which are basically structures that shape time, right? And what he's referring to with discussing Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Berg and these others is that it's like different forms of time are making their way into the music, so you're not just getting this sort of presupposed time, which is natural time or ontological time, real time, but the kind of blend of that kind of time with the different lived experience of time, from the sort of anxiety time that's in Stravinsky to the more sort of floating and almost gauze-like temporal landscapes that somebody like Debussy creates. And certainly one of the interesting things that happens in
Oh, is that just me, or did we lose Marco a little bit?
He stopped on my feed too.
Yeah, we lost.
I'm back.
Okay.
All I was gonna complete by saying that that we get a lot of different experiments with time, a lot of different experiments with how we experience time and how we embody that or express that in these musical soundscapes. And it's cool to kind of get this kind of snapshot from Gebser, writing or publishing in 1953, 1940s into the early 50s, but then at the same time knowing, what comes after that with the explosion of pop music and electronic music, global music. I mean, all these different ways that we can go into different experiences of time, from this kind of space timelessness of a trance, or different kind of like electronic music, to like the ambient sort of timelessness, to the more directed forms of like techno, where you're just getting a beat and you're kind of driving, I think that it was really interesting for me to see how we kind of go beyond like these sense of like dualities, major and minor forms of music, for example, as being an example of dualistic music. You're either going major or minor, or you're going between the two. And what if that's not the polarity that you're working with? Like, what if the music like much more flexibly interchanges between different modes? I think that's what he's pointing to with this in this section. The last thing I want to come back to Philip Glass and the idea of minimalism, because part of I love Philip Glass. He's one of my favorite composers, and it occurred to me that this idea of minimalism, I thought about it in a new way, that it really is about transparency, because if you can take away all the kind of unnecessary ornamentation, you get to like a clearer experience of the impulse that's illuminating, or that's kind of flowing into the music itself. And there's something about minimalism that's not just about repeating loops and things like that, but that actually tries to get at a transparency and this diaphaneity that we've been talking about. So anyway, we have other sections here. We don't have to just talk about it.
I would want to respond, Marco, to one thing you said. I don't really disagree with anything that you're saying. I would even amplify what you're saying. That one reason why the break from tonal music, a lot of people felt had to occur, was that there was something in the German-dominated tradition, really culminating with Brahms, that people felt to be fascinatingly and subtly oppressive. That it was an oppressive structure that we all everyone interested in classical music kind of voluntarily participated in, paradoxically, but couldn't get around, couldn't get around, and it was not allowing the common person's experience in. So I think in that first generation of people who broke from that structure, Stravinsky, you mentioned, and Schoenberg, and the rest of them, among the other, I've read a lot about this topic, and there's a lot. It's hard to get your mind around it. I don't think anybody really understands exactly what happened, but among the perspectives there, not the first ones you'd read about, but if you continue reading, there are murmurings about how this lets in different layers of and a broader sense of humanity's perspectives. So I resonate some of with what you're saying. I also like Philip Glass's music too. Philip Glass's music is not atonal, by the way. It's definitely in a tonal. When I said that I thought that 20th century music might have gone a little too far, Philip Glass's music is in some ways quite conservative, tonally speaking. He stays in various keys, usually in a major or minor mode, actually, as far as I understand. Anyway, I guess that's all.
Yeah. John Cage would be a really good example to talk about, though, because
that's not like can't stand, but
he was not classically trained in all of this music stuff, but as a millennial, I guess, I'd be more interested in how the heck we would interpret something like dubstep or pogo or all this modern electronic music and how crazy it is and what that represents. But maybe that'd be for another time. I feel like we could do a whole 90-minute session on music.
We structure it a little because there's so many different cells. I can't say anything about all that stuff because I don't listen to it. I don't even know what it is. The pogo used to be a dance, right? Safety dance. I'm sure you're talking about something else.
This is an artist.
But by the way, that stuff, but just to respond to one other last thing, as you're reminding me, Marco and Jeremy, that stuff was not, it's not like pop music didn't exist in the 50s when Gebser was writing. There was always different traditions, but let's not exaggerate or talk about all traditions as if they're all just in a big horizontal space. There is this way, I think we all collectively understand that the tradition of classical music, yes, of course, it's just one among many, but it's also a certain development, polyphonic music since the Renaissance, that went maybe a step deeper or a different way. There's a guy called, has anyone here on this call heard of a guy called William Benson? It's a little bit obscure, but somebody here might have read him. He's a jazz musician who wrote a book called Beethoven's Anvil, and he's sort of in parallel to various developmental theories like Wilbur and this stuff. He talks about, three basic elements of music: rhythm, melody, and polyphony, and they emerge at different points in history, and he's trying to develop kind of a universal progression and then casting about amid the wilderness of 20th century music to see if there's a fourth iteration or a combination of all three that's truly novel, and I think he ends up being equivocal about it. Anyway.
Cool, guys. Well, let's move to architecture, shall we? Just out of necessity, we got about 45 minutes left, and we still have to get. We could try to get through everything. There's still painting. There is still literature. So anyway, back to architecture. I thought it was interesting, and again, it's just mid-century stuff, but he talks about Frank Lloyd Wright, and Marco, just to bring your point, you mentioned about musical minimalism. I think there's a certain element of that also in architecture here, especially when Gebser is talking about architecture that is free of style to the same extent that the new music is free of measure. And he mentions style as a form of spiritual constipation, quoting Frank Lloyd Wright. That was pretty hilarious. But, okay, so a couple of interesting things. I'm a big fan of Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, and I've always enjoyed it. I always thought it was one of the more interesting architectural and artistic movements in North America. But I thought a few interesting quotes here is that he mentions that Frank Lloyd Wright describes his style as a new standard of space. And then he also says It is significant that not only have space values entirely changed to time values, forming a new standard of measurement, but a new sense of spacing is here. Again, quoting Wright. And then he describes Wright's construction as breaking away from a static and spatially bound mode of construction, the interpenetration of space, a lightness, a differentiation between structure and wall planes. So there's a kind of movement that he's describing in Frank Lloyd Wright's houses, and I think not only Frank Lloyd Wright, but a lot of mid-century architecture tried to express this kind of movement, this motion of smooth planes, openness of space, intersecting planes that aren't really the same kind of space that we think of in terms of Renaissance space and perspectivalism, but a kind of transparency, and especially with the use of glass and the use of kind of seeing through the buildings into the exterior, the opening up of a building so it connects with the landscape or to the sky. There's kind of interesting diaphanous qualities to mid-century architecture, which I really liked, and I didn't feel, me personally, I didn't feel that it was necessarily, I don't know, old-fashioned or too rationalistic. I thought it had another quality to it. So it's nice to see that Gebser's talking about the same kind of thing. So those are sort of my initial points. And another thing is that I don't know about you guys, but I've been noticing, because I'm studying like tiny houses and sustainable architecture, a lot of these descriptions and writings about what architecture and the perspectival, they're all coming back. They all seem to be coming back. And I found that to be really interesting about like eco-design and everything. But any initial impressions on architecture?
It's such
Or am I the only one?
it's a hard art, because it's such a, unlike music or books, or a work of architecture is always somebody else's property. Other than your own house, and I couldn't afford to have an architect design a house for me and make something really cool and special and unique. So I basically live in what is available. I just live in an old neighborhood where not a lot of aesthetic thought was necessarily put into the buildings around here, and that may be something that's different about the United States and Europe, where, because the structures here just aren't even as old, that there's you just don't have that kind of deep connection to history, which shows up in the architecture that arises in older parts of the world. Or older, that it's but I don't mean older parts of the world. I mean like more continuously existing societies, and so it's something that I don't usually pay attention to. It's like another one of the things that you take for granted a lot of times, but that informs or shapes your experience when you're when you're in a space, whether it's a mall or Grand Central Station, or a museum, and because it's sort of like contextual and not like something that you sit and focus on in the way that you do with a piece of music or a work of literature, I think it's just a different, we have a different relationship to it, and so I appreciated the points about how how the sort of impulse went from creating like a cave-like interior space to creating these like open spaces, and now we have, it affects our work life even, intersects with that, and the idea of going from like a cubicle and this enclosed space to an open space or an open floor plan. He makes a reference to that, although that wasn't, I think, the exact context of his points there. So
the thing about that too is that even today with the shift out of sort of the traditional business floor plan to now these shared common spaces that you rent at, a section of the table. And there's a kind of reiteration of that even today with, I forgot what they call it, but it's sort of like, where multiple businesses and startups go and they rent a space and things like that.
Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the architects who created these, floor plans with huge open spaces and light streaming in from all sides. And now, it's a common thing in the corporate world. That's one option that you might have is, creating a workspace with an open floor plan. Facebook is an example of that. And this idea of openness, this idea of sharing, it comes through in how they have structured their space in which they work. I mean, they want to emphasize openness. They want people to share on their network, and so they create a workspace which is open, where Mark Zuckerberg is sitting there in the open, with his developers and designers and other people sitting around him. They don't enclose themselves into these partitions, which is a very mental, rational kind of thing, the sectorized space of the cubicles. But you do lose something. You lose this sense of privacy. As a writer, it would be death to me to work in a space like that. I could never do it. It just wouldn't happen. So there's definitely something that there's some sort of iteration where we can combine openness and enclosure, maybe that allows for a greater integration between the different dimensions that come into play as we're in our work life or social life. I like spaces that are multidimensional. I like spaces where there's openness, but there's also these enclaves and these places where you can go to be alone. I mean, those are I think the interesting types of structures that are created. I'm just rambling a little bit, but there's a place called the Integral Center here in Boulder, and I went to an event there the other night, and I've actually I have a long history with it because Integral Institute used it as an office. But one of the things that's cool about this space, from the outside, it's just a box. I mean, you couldn't tell if there's anything special about going on inside. But when you go inside, one part of it actually used to be a church. So it has this kind of vaulted quality to it. And you even kind of get the, that sort of ceiling with the beams going across and the altar. But then you go into other sections, and in the basement, for example, and you'll find these really intimate spaces where you could have a quiet conversation with somebody, or these meditation spaces where you could just sit and be alone. And it doesn't all center around one particular thing or even one particular function. And I think that's one of the interesting things that these sort of aperspectival spaces, or an aperspectival approach to architecture and to floor planning and to interior design could introduce.
Well, what'll be interesting, Marco, is if that actually does translate into more of the corporate spaces that you were talking about, because while they're moving to this more open space floor plan concept, like you said, there's a lot that gets lost in terms of productivity and being able to think in those environments, and we ended up putting on headsets and blocking everybody out so we can actually get work done. I mean, I love your example of the Integral Institute, because that's what you need. You need, I think, those different types of spaces that you can float in between, kind of what Gebser is saying, like if all of the modes of consciousness are integral, then we kind of float back and forth between all of them depending on what we need at any particular time. They're all good, but we need to kind of land on one or the other as we're trying to get certain things done. So it'll be interesting to see if the rest of the corporate world catches up to what the Integral Institute is doing. Because I've been in a lot of those places like, hey, we're going to throw everybody in a big open floor plan and everybody's going to work together, and that's great, except I'm trying to code something. And if it's ones and zeros, and you can be as open as you want, but at the end of the day, it's ones and zeros. And if those ones and zeros don't line up, my code's not going to work. So I need quiet space that I can just sit and think, and then, once I'm done, I'll come out and socialize and be pleasant with everybody else. So hopefully maybe, that'll be interesting to see if there's an evolution of consciousness in architecture in those terms.
There's a great book. It's called The Poetics of Space, and the author's name is escaping me right now. But it's basically about what we're talking about, how the spaces kind of enable different experiences. I mean, we can even say in different forms of time, different aesthetic experiences, different social experiences, and like a corporate. What corporations tend to do is they'll tend to kind of latch onto an idea. What's the next, the latest cool thing. that's going to increase productivity or make the company a cool place to work or what have you. And so you go into this sort of open idea or this open floor plan idea, and Bachelard, that's right, thanks, and it doesn't actually work with our inherent constitutional complexity, where we move between different modes of different things that we need to do. Like I was saying, I cannot write. I couldn't code. I couldn't write in a space like that, which is why I have this place. This is my cave. It's like my man cave, evolved, and but I wouldn't want to really have a party in here. So anyway, it's the interior exterior is an interesting dimension to it, and even the interior self, a self's interiority and exteriority, I think, comes into play when we talk about spaces and poetics of space.
I think that's a very important point, Marco. Space has a huge impact on us, one that we are not very often aware of. I never really got it until I moved to Europe again, after spending a long time in Silicon Valley, and I worked for Borland for a while as a contractor, and they had a marvelous place to work. It was probably the best working environment I was ever in, because in the building, everything was in that cubicle kind of, you're separate but you're not. But Wendy will appreciate this. All the programmers had their own offices. Because yeah, but they had things like nap rooms, and they had this wonderful inner court in this U-shaped Japanese pagoda building with a fountain, and they had designed there was a little stream that ran down through it.
Oh, wow.
And they had sloped the banks of this little stream so that you could lie out there and always see over the roofs and see the clouds moving in from the ocean and whatnot. And you were practically driven outside on a regular basis to just go out and sit, not
That's
to
cool.
do anything, whatever. And that was in very stark contrast, because I had worked in defense for 10 years. And there, it was simply just like chickens in a battery, and lay your eggs, and that's what the cubicles were about. And it was push, 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 push. So the spaces that we find ourselves in, if we can't construct them in some ways, do have a very significant effect on us, and the external spaces do as well. Today I went with my daughters and wife up to Kassel, which is not far from here. And in my estimation, it's the second ugliest city in Germany. The most ugly is Stuttgart, where I used to live. And they have absolutely no sense of aesthetics, because this is where the ugly never becomes beautiful. They just kind of throw buildings in next to each other. So you'll have a Gothic cathedral here, and next to it you have this glass steel box with mirrored windows that is everything other than transparent, and so the spaces that we encounter outside are just as significant. The only thing that both Stuttgart and Kassel have that I find redeeming characteristics, they have lots of squares and plazas like you find in Italy. Places where you can simply go and sit. Like we were encouraged to do at Borland, just go and sit. And once you get that inspiration from these environs, and they're little coves, and they're little corners, and they're little, not always a cave, sometimes a cave, but they're there, and they're very inspirational in many ways. Since the women were off doing something, I got to go take a walk with my grandson and see these things again. So, space itself and how it's used has a huge impact on all of us. And it's much underestimated, I believe, and it's something we don't think about. The company I worked with in Germany here for the last 18 years, it took us 5 years from the time I showed up to have people have the doors open to their offices. Just just that much openness was too much for
Yeah.
most of them. And we all had 2 or 3 person offices, up to
Wow.
4 person offices. So that was the togetherness, but the door was always closed. Very confining, I can tell you. Very confining. But at any rate.
It looks like Jeremy has dropped off, and I just want to acknowledge that we have a new participant on the call, David Zuckerman, and I think I recognize you, David, from the last Gebser conference. So, would you want to introduce yourself and say hi, and maybe talk about where you're at with the book, and
Can you hear me?
or with respect to absolutely.
Okay, so I'm a professor in Sacramento. I'm a former president of the Gebser Society, and a very long time member of various Gebser groups, but and co-author of a Gebserian textbook in intercultural communication that's published by by Kendall Hunt. Sorry, I'm trying to get my act together here. And my computer has been uncooperative, so I've been here and gone and here and gone. So I feel like I've missed lots of parts of the conversation. Say again?
Looks like something happened there.
Yeah.
Nicholas.
So I heard a voice.
I think you can go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm reluctant to jump in because I've missed so many bits and pieces of the conversation. But so I'm just sort of in lurk mode right now.
It's good to see you. Could you remind me what your presentation was at the last conference?
At the one in San Francisco?
Yeah.
I talked about Chinese identity.
Oh, that's right. That's right, because you were living in China for a long time.
I was.
And you were working with students at totally different understandings of.
Yeah, I was teaching in Beijing, and I was looking at identity and how complex Chinese identity is. But in a previous conference years ago, and then in the second, maybe it was the first Gebser annual published by Hampton Press. Right, that was the title. I had a chapter about Northern Ireland and identity in Northern Ireland. And when we're talking about art and we're talking about the public and the private, that's pretty relevant. That one of the things that has happened in Belfast is that the Belfast Arts Council has tried to sort of retake these spaces that have been claimed by various paramilitary groups. These murals that everybody has seen in pictures of Belfast, where there'll be like a 3-story mural of a guy with a RPG or an AK-47, and he's wearing a mask, and he's warning you to stay away from the neighborhood. And the Belfast Arts Council has actually started to reclaim these spaces in a really ingenious way. They have hired professional artists, and they've been very careful not to match the religious background of the artist with the community, and they've brought the kids in the community together with the artist to draft a plan of what will replace this mural. Is it a different kind of mural? Is it a photography exhibit? Is it a sculpture? Some kind of public art. And rather than the artist creating the artist teaches the teenagers in the neighborhood and the preteens in the neighborhood how to create the art, and they do it together. And then these kids in the neighborhood then own this piece of art. And by its very nature, by moving away from this sectarian, violent kind of mural, it becomes more aperspectival just in and of itself. So I wanted to throw that out there as something that's actually really happening